Hello once again everyone, KMAC 2021 here. Before we start this episode, I'd like to make some extra clarifications. The subgenres and variations that I did not explain in detail are ones that I think are fairly self-explanatory. For instance, death doom is obviously a mix of doom metal and death metal. But you might see the term funeral doom and wonder what that is. So as a quick aside, funeral doom is a mix of doom metal and death metal with a strong influence from funeral dirges for an extra gloomy atmosphere. It's an extremely slow and very atmospheric subgenre. It also tends to have absolutely gorgeous album art, which is probably for the best because you're going to be staring at it for a long time. Sometimes I can enjoy it, but for the most part I don't have the patience to sit through an entire album of it in one go. Sorry, what can I say? I'm a zoomer. I have no attention span. Also, while talking about the development of the death growl, I said that Max Cavalera had black metal influenced vocals, referring of course to the first wave and the Brazilian black and thrash scene with bands like Sarcophago. But black metal vocals are generally higher pitched than that. I think this may just be a case of his individual thrash vocals being particularly deep and harsh, rather than a conscious effort to create a new kind of vocal. Also, Chuck Schuldiner did do a lot to help develop death metal vocals, but his style is quite atypical for death metal. Lower vocals are a good general rule for death metal, but higher screams can still be used. Also, apparently Leprous aren't a black gaze band, they're just more general prog. I had seen them collaborate with Izan, so I just assumed they had more of a black metal tie-in, but I guess not. If you have any other corrections or differing interpretations of things, feel free to share them, and if I accumulate enough of them, I'll make another wee appendix to the end of this series. Now, it's time to revisit metalcore, because there's a lot I missed out. Basically, I ended up talking about the era of metalcore that I was exposed to, but didn't properly look into the different waves or the history or backstory of it. I really just discussed metalcore as I knew it from what I was exposed to. But this time, I've gone and done a bit more research and properly looked into it. I apologise, I should have done that in the first place, but I thought I already knew. Turns out there's a lot more to it. First of all, let's skim over hardcore punk.
What can I do?
Now, punk isn't really my thing. I'm into metal first and foremost, but I'll do my best to give a brief summary. First things first, hardcore punk is not metal, as fans of both music genres will insist. It has the same instruments, sure, but so does most rock music. Hardcore punk takes the sound of punk rock and makes it more extreme, so the songs are fast and the riffs are basic but effective, with a shouting vocal style which sounds aggressive, but nothing as inhuman or ridiculous as a death growl. While metal is all about the music, punk has always been more than that, often overtly political with a firmly anti-fascist culture. More often than not, punk bands tend to be left-wing, but more consistently, they're libertarian in some way or another. Well, apart from Nazi punk, obviously. In addition, punk has always had a close relationship with anarchism. This isn't to say that metal doesn't get overtly political sometimes, but the politics of punk are a key part of the genre's identity, and hardcore is no different, with many bands writing about general discontent with the status quo, and some writing about more personal issues. There was also the straight edge movement in the hardcore scene where certain bands were explicitly against drugs and alcohol, although that certainly wasn't every band. There's also a crucial DIY attitude and atmosphere, with everything feeling very raw and human rather than especially technical. Additionally, the shows had a key sense of intimacy with the audience, allowing fans to jump on and off the stage and even sing parts of the songs. Hardcore was very underground, yet hugely influential, with scenes popping up all over the US, especially in New York. Notable bands include Cro-Mags, Madball, and Agnostic Front. From the very start, punk had some influence on metal, particularly with thrash, and this led to what was known as crossover thrash, with bands like Suicidal Tendencies and Dirty Rotten Imbeciles mixing thrash and hardcore and accumulating a fan base from both audiences. Metalcore was an attempt to combine the sounds of hardcore and metal while also maintaining the atmosphere and culture of hardcore. The hardcore sound is a lot more obvious in early metalcore. Small underground metalcore scenes started springing up within the hardcore scenes of the early 90s, with bands like Converge and Hatebreed. But the band that made the biggest impact early on was Earth Crisis, who not only mixed hardcore and metal in such a way that was controversial at the time, they were also both straight edge and vegan. This brought a lot of ire their way, but with that, a lot of attention. The riffs sounded like a mix of the stomping, mosh-worthy riffs of hardcore, combined with some of the technicality of metal. And of course, breakdowns became a staple of their songs, with broken up riffs where the guitars sync up with the bass drums to create this sort of machine gun sound. The guitar tone also sounded a little bit cleaner and closer to metal. This kind of metalcore had a strong underground following with a mix of hardcore fans and metalheads in the audience. But it was the second wave of metalcore when this subgenre went mainstream, after it was picked up by an unexpected subculture. The second wave is where metalcore was able to converge with emo music. You see, a lot of kids who were listening to My Chemical Romance reached the stage where they needed something heavier, and metalcore happened to be the right scene at the right time. No one has a definitive answer for exactly what brought the emo scene and the metalcore scene together, but it wasn't long before new metalcore bands started springing up sporting eyeliner and dark fringes. It was the second wave when the hardcore influences became less obvious, and the metal influences started to produce micro-genres. At the Gates core refers to metalcore bands with a strong influence from melodic death metal, and this was easily the most popular form of metalcore in the 2000s. The riffs had more melody and solos, and clean singing was utilised in the choruses. Now, I'm not against this concept, but the vocal melodies in a lot of metalcore tend to be incredibly whiny and poppy. As such, I'm not really into most of this stuff. The lyrics of the second wave of metalcore really strayed away from politics and focused more on personal issues, but crucially they were the kinds of personal issues that 13-year-olds could relate to. A lot of metalcore sounds like a much angrier Jimmy Eat World as a result. For whatever reason, there were a lot of Christian metalcore bands who used their platform to spread their faith. In fact, there are a lot of metalcore bands who you only find out are Christian when someone tells you or you read it on Wikipedia, because in this era, they pretty much all sounded the same. The most famous Christcore band is As I Lay Dying. They wanted to take the aggressive sound of metalcore, but infuse it with Christian lyrics, bringing about their Christian ethos of love, forgiveness, acceptance, and hiring a hitman to kill your wife. Look, say what you will about the Satanists in the black metal scene, at least they do their own dirty work. Bullet for My Valentine, Early Avenged Sevenfold, As I Lay Dying, Trivium, and Killswitch Engage are just a few examples from this era, but I'm not kidding when I say that the number of metalcore bands was absolutely overwhelming. This was due to the MySpace era, when anyone could form a new band in their mum's garage and upload the songs to the internet. Some of the bands I just mentioned actually started this way and managed to come from total obscurity to stardom through a now dead social media website. As such, a shitload of significantly less talented kids tried to do the same. For the longest time, I never fully understood why metalcore is so hated by older metal fans, because I wasn't around when this was happening. But after doing some research, I think I get it now. See, my exposure to metalcore was after all this happened, so the few bands worth checking out had already been filtered out for me, and the rest had faded away. But in the mid-2000s, generic metalcore was inescapable. But it's never that simple when it comes to truly hated music. It's one thing to dislike music, but the visceral hatred that metalcore provoked in some metal fans was quite clearly to do with the audience these bands attracted. The emo scene and the metal scene had very little in common, and consequently didn't get along that well. To make matters worse, as I mentioned in part 5, since metalcore got so mainstream, normies, for lack of a better word, began to conflate metalheads and emo kids, which only served to further infuriate the metal scene. Essentially, a lot of the the hatred for metalcore fans came from the fact that a lot of them were just following a trend and would eventually move on when they lost interest in metal. They didn't seem to care about exploring any metal outside of mainstream metalcore and flooded the market with interchangeable oversaturated shite where they would just play a few breakdowns and call it a day. Even after the imitators died down, in the 2010s, mainstream metalcore somehow got worse.
You know what that means, you little shits?
We go crabcore to some attack.
With the melodies becoming even more obnoxious and sickeningly poppy. I'm not kidding when I say some of these choruses genuinely make me gag. Asking Alexandria and Of Mice and Men are two particularly egregious examples, but easily the most infamous is Attack Attack. This is the band that also invented the little joke subgenre known as crabcore, which, like I said, is just metalcore, but you squat like a crab when you play your shitty breakdowns. Fucking Mozart over here. Over time, the pop elements completely took over, and the few mainstream metalcore bands that are still around don't play metalcore anymore. Whether it's Avenged Sevenfold playing their own proggy radio rock, or Bring Me the Horizon making full-on pop music. Basically, any of the bands that were remotely relevant have since moved on. So I genuinely understand where the resentment towards metalcore comes from. I used to think it was just boomers who hated anything new that young people like, but after looking into it, I'm genuinely humbled. Like, I'm sorry, I apologise, I should have listened. However, I do think it needs to be put into perspective. 3 things need to be remembered. For one, we need to keep in mind that this isn't how metalcore started. Early metalcore sounds very different to the generic emo-core we got in the late 2000s. It seems like it started as a combination of metal and hardcore, then it was a combination of metal and metalcore, then a combination of metalcore and pop. So the bad stuff isn't how metalcore started, meaning it's not inherently bad as a subgenre. Secondly, not every scene kid was just hopping on a trend. Oh sure, that's how a lot of them will have started, but plenty stuck around and discovered a love of metal through these mainstream bands. We all have to start somewhere, and there's no shame in that. Lastly, and this is just my opinion, even the worst metalcore is still metal. Oh sure, you can have a different definition than me and argue that metalcore is excluded, but any definition that excludes metalcore will exclude other stuff that's generally agreed upon to be metal. If combining metal with non-metal influences makes it no longer metal, then I've got bad news for the entire fucking subgenre of prog metal. The reason I didn't have metalcore as a primary subgenre is because it's really a mix of elements of pre-existing subgenres with an external, non-metal influence, i.e. hardcore. But considering just how big and influential metalcore has become, I think it could be the 8th primary subgenre. So I guess this one is kind of the optional DLC subgenre, but it is there, assuming you consider it to be metal, which some people don't. I do, but some people don't, so keep that in mind. At the end of the day, I prefer to be open-minded and inclusive about these things, so here it is on my chart. As for the state of metalcore now, there's a sort of 4th wave known as post-metalcore. This is the particularly djenty variety, as exemplified by bands like Architects. There has also been a recent revival of bands going back to the more hardcore sound of early metalcore, with bands like Vane and Knocked Loose receiving critical acclaim for their recent albums where they did exactly that. The kids who were into metalcore back in the day are now either super into deathcore or Billie Eilish. But the 2010s seem to be the last gasp of this subgenre. And with that, we've wrapped up my follow-ups. I'd like to think this will be the last part, but like I said, I'm always learning, and metal is always evolving. Don't hesitate to correct me if you think I got something wrong. Even if it turns out to just be a difference of opinion, it's worth discussing. Plus, it's not like I've got much else to do these days. Stay safe, everyone. A subgenre scholar's work is never done. There's always more to cover. It's been 2 years since I started this series, and for the most part, I'm still happy with it. Although looking back, there are some odd choices, like this weird flex with these books. Only 2 of those are particularly relevant, and I didn't even finish that one. Yet, you best believe we have some more corrections to get through. So, in no particular order, let's fire through them. Speed metal was overshadowed by thrash, but it's unfair to say that it became obsolete. In fact, it has had a strong revival in recent years, which I'll touch on later. I called Mastodon a sludge metal band, but I think I would only really class their first album as straightforward sludge. I Hate God is a much better example of the sludge sound. I have no clue where I got the idea that goat sacrifices were a thing in the Norwegian black metal scene. If a band has sacrificed a goat live on stage, then I haven't heard about it. Plenty of goat heads and blood has been used for stage decoration by various bands, but those were already dead before the show started. If anyone has heard of a goat sacrifice actually happening at a show, then let me know. But until then, it's safe to assume I was just talking out my arse there. I pointed out that King Diamond's music does not sound at all like black metal despite him wearing corpse paint. And that is true, he plays heavy metal, just like he did when he was in Merciful Fate. But I should point out that that band actually had a very important influence on the creation of black metal, particularly its lyrical themes and aesthetic. So much so that some people actually consider Merciful Fate to be part of the first wave of black metal. I am not one of those people, but I definitely recognise the impact they had. I don't think I emphasised enough how influential At the Gates were in popularising Melodeath. Like every subgenre, it's difficult to determine who was the very first to create it, but In Flames are often credited with making the first proper Melodeath album with the Jester race. In Flames, along with Dark Tranquillity, were crucial pioneers of the sound. But At the Gates' Slaughter of the Soul really set the blueprint for what much of the genre would sound like, and also what most mid-2000s metalcore would sound like. I said Roots was the best thing to come out of new metal, and it does have a few songs that I think still hold up, but I recently re-listened to it, and the album as a whole isn't as good as I remember. This isn't really a correction, but it's my up-to-date opinion. Opeth do actually use a lot of odd time signatures. Michael Okerfeldt happens to be my favourite death metal vocalist, and that's all I meant when I called his vocals the best you'll ever hear. Also, I went through a phase of trying to do the proper Swedish pronunciation of his name, but everyone around him just calls him Michael, so I'll do the same. I still consider Meshuggah to be separate from metalcore, but I think at this point it would be perfectly reasonable to call Gent progressive metalcore, as Meshuggah clearly aren't the only influence on the genre. In fact, most gent bands are doing their best to imitate Periphery instead, which is appropriate since Misha Mansour popularised the term gent, although he credits Frederick Thorndendahl as being the first to use it. A few times throughout the series, I used the phrase metal elitists, and looking back on that, I cringe quite a bit, because people often treat this as though it's some unique problem for metal, but elitism exists in every music fandom. In fact, it exists in every fandom full stop. Elitist is a term that gets thrown around a lot to the point that it feels kind of meaningless now, but it's supposed to mean someone who views their taste as superior to others. So, by its proper definition, I find music elitism of any kind to be completely absurd and beyond childish. Your preferred sequence of noises is no better than someone else's, and listening to a particular band is not a fucking achievement. That being said, just because someone dislikes mainstream metal bands, that doesn't mean they're an elitist. I mean, it's possible to be a pop elitist, for fuck's sake. It's about someone's attitude towards their own opinions, and not their opinions themselves. I feel I misused the term a few times throughout the series, so I'm going to make sure not to do that in future. I was right about Typo Negative the first time. They are doom metal, specifically gothic doom, but we'll get to that later. I said that the first wave of black metal pioneered blast beats, but this isn't accurate. The origins of the blast beat are traced back to grindcore. Mick Harris, the drummer of Napalm Death, is most often credited with inventing the beat, although some suggest that Repulsion did it first. Either way, it comes from grindcore, not the first wave of black metal. I think a lot of metalcore bands can be considered metal, but metalcore as a whole is a subgenre of hardcore punk, as is grindcore. This will likely be controversial, so I'll go into more detail in my section on defining metal. Now, given metal's affinity for controversial and sacrilegious imagery, I was bound to say something insensitive towards people's religious beliefs without realising it. So I believe I owe an apology to Satanists. I made fun of black metal bands that claim to worship Satan because I think that would be dumb. But actual Satanists don't literally believe in Satan. It's more of a philosophy. That was partly my point, in that a lot of bands talk about Satanism in a way that makes it sound like they don't understand it, but I should have made that clearer. After doing some digging, I discovered part of the reason why black metal fans hate black gaze so much. It's mostly to do with mainstream metal and general music press giving excellent reviews to black gaze while shitting on modern black metal. Bands that briefly experiment with a little bit of black metal are lauded as the next step in the subgenre's evolution, despite having little influence over the actual black metal scene. I called the second wave of metalcore emocore as a joke, but then it was pointed out to me that emocore is actually a thing. It's a subgenre of hardcore, because of course it fucking is. Word of advice to all of you, don't make up a subgenre as a joke, because it probably exists already. It turns out the grind part of grindcore comes from the grindy sound of the bass. When Repulsion recorded their first album, they supposedly lost the bass track somehow and had to use the scratch track, meaning they were using a rough playthrough that was never intended to be used in the final project. It sounded noisy and horrible, but they just went with it, only to find that it sounded noisy and horrible, so their fans loved it. It wasn't just grindcore fans either. Some death metal and black metal bands like to borrow this bass sound too, but it is an essential component of grindcore and it's where the name comes from. After putting up the challenge, someone did manage to articulate the differences between bestial black metal and war metal. To paraphrase how they put it, all bestial black metal is war metal, but not the other way around. Bestial black metal has a particularly raw, primitive sound, whereas regular war metal allows more technical elements in. Basically, bestial black metal has an unbreakable commitment to caveman riffs, while war metal has at least developed basic irrigation. As a few of you pointed out, Cannibal Corpse are originally from New York, and only moved to Florida to join the blossoming Florida death metal scene. I had assumed that they already lived there, partly due to their Ace Ventura appearance, and Pat O'Brien behaving like a quintessential Florida man. It was very harsh and unfair to call Avenged Sevenfold's newer stuff radio rock. Yes, they have had a lot of mainstream and radio success, but that's not the same thing. They went in a groove metal direction, often sounding like the spiritual successor to the Black Album, and in recent years they've gone in a prog direction, which is a far cry from Nickelback. One commenter suggested that alt metal is better used to refer to Rage Against the Machine, Faith No More, and Primus, rather than bands that aren't quite nu metal. I'd say why not both? Alt metal is a deliberately vague label for metal adjacent stuff that's a little too weird to fit in an established subgenre. So I'd say it works for quite a few things. Lastly, there were actually a few bands that developed the groove metal sound before Pantera, namely White Zombie, Prong, and Ex-Hoarder. None of them reached as much mainstream success as Pantera, but without them, Pantera might have stayed a glam band. I know quite a few contrarians who would have preferred that, but history moves on. And with that, I'm done with my corrections. Let's move on to the most glaring omission in the entire series: how I define metal. I always assumed that this would go without saying, but in all honesty, it really doesn't. It's actually surprisingly difficult to articulate. Now, the way people argue about what does and doesn't count indicates to me that people are using the same word to mean different things. As such, don't take my answer here as some cowardly refusal to take a stance. This is just the best way I can summarise the two competing schools of thought on the topic. We have definition A and definition B. Now, I just made this up, so don't refer to definition A or definition B outside of this series because no one will know what you're on about. Definition A is the casual definition. It's the most broad and inclusive, and it's also the definition which I had been using rather uncritically until this point. By this standard, metal is pretty much any heavy distorted guitar music which is heavier than hard rock. As such, Everything I've covered so far fits under this definition. It's nice and inclusive, but it's also very vague when it comes to the line between metal and punk. This is the definition you probably use already, and it's what most people refer to when they use the term metal music colloquially. As such, this is the standard you should use when talking to people in real life, or in online communities which are not explicitly based around metal. Definition B is the stricter standard. According to Definition B, Definition A's standard should just be called heavy music. Metal is just one specific form of heavy music alongside hard rock and punk, and Definition B is more specific about what does and does not count as metal. Rather than simply being heavy guitar music, metal requires a specific style of riffs, and its roots must be mostly in heavy metal rather than in punk or hard rock. This definition gets controversial because it excludes quite a lot of stuff. Nu metal, unsurprisingly, is out, as is metalcore, grindcore, and some variations of groove metal. Now, this will no doubt sound very surprising if you're used to Definition A. You must be thinking, hold the phone, you're telling me this? And this? Isn't metal? Well, yes. Heaviness is necessary but not sufficient for music to be metal according to Definition B. So, if someone says that deathcore isn't metal, they're not denying that it's heavy because, quite frankly, they can't. They're just pointing out that its roots lie in hardcore rather than heavy metal. Some of you might object to this. When you think of hardcore, you probably think of Black Flag and Dead Kennedys, and no disrespect to those bands, but there's a pretty big difference between this and this. The problem here is that the best known hardcore bands are the earliest. Hardcore got a lot heavier over time, just like metal did. You could just as easily flip this and say, how can you say Defeated Sanity are a metal band when they sound like this? And metal sounds like this. You're not getting the full picture. When it comes to a fusion genre like metalcore, which combines metal and hardcore, it seems like it should count as both, but it must be one more than the other, and we determine this by looking at its origins. It started out as a subgenre of hardcore, taking a metal influence. In fact, it was originally called metallic hardcore before the catchier name caught on. So as a rule, I would say that metalcore is not metal, but there are many exceptions. You have to take it on a case-by-case basis. There are some bands, such as most melodic metalcore bands, whose songs are basically 90% at the gates plagiarism followed by a breakdown. If the majority of the song is in the style of metal, it would be absurd to suggest that it suddenly becomes hardcore as soon as the tempo slows. So, there are metalcore bands which lean closer to metal, which I think still count as metal, even under Definition B. But the metalcore subgenre as a whole is a subgenre of hardcore rather than a subgenre of metal, if that makes sense. Similarly, grindcore is generally not metal, but some bands, namely death grind bands, lean more into the metal side of things, and I think it would be fair to call them metal. Again, that's on a case-by-case basis. Now you might think that this sounds needlessly pedantic, and that's honestly fair. There's a pretty compelling theory that if Metallica started out with short hair and wrote lyrics about life on the street, thrash metal wouldn't exist, and we would instead be talking about the big four of thrashcore. It is a tad arbitrary, but that's just semantics for you. Now, don't take from this that metal and hardcore are two completely different worlds that never interact. Throughout the history of both genres, bands were constantly influencing each other and collaborating, and there are clear parallels in terms of subgenre development. Hardcore and thrash metal, grindcore and death metal, crust punk and black metal. The reason the distinction is made is purely to be extra specific to help people find what music they like. No one can credibly give you any grief for listening to both. All the band members certainly do, and you'll rarely find a fan of death metal who isn't also a fan of grindcore, and vice versa. As for nu metal, definition B suggests that it's a subgenre of hard rock. This is because the term nu metal was coined as a marketing gimmick rather than a naturally arising term among fans as a way of categorising their music. As such, it lumps a lot of bands together who don't really have enough in common. Slipknot are very different to Linkin Park, for example. In turn, I feel nu metal best describes a particular era and aesthetic, rather than one specific sound. Once again, my answer is to take bands on a case-by-case basis for whether they count as metal. For instance, I would call Linkin Park hard rock, but I still think it's totally fair to count Slipknot as metal. Now, I don't even like Slipknot, but I listened to enough of their music when I was younger to be completely baffled by takes that call them hard rock and say that their sound comes from alternative and grunge. What kind of fucking meth head grunge were you listening to? Definition B is the definition you'll want to use in online metal spaces. It's the most specific and technically accurate standard, but it's also quite restrictive, and casual fans of heavy music fucking hate it when some pedantic arsehole bogs everyone down in the fine details. Genres and subgenres are supposed to be a tool to help people find more music they will like. They're not a means of flexing how little you go outside to strangers. I would recommend using definition A in casual conversation and definition B for more in-depth discussion. I'll give an analogy to help. It's kind of like how words are used differently by academics than they are in their day-to-day use. In day-to-day life, a valid argument just means a good point, whereas in philosophy, it specifically refers to an argument in which if you assume all the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. So, when you're writing a philosophy essay, you make sure to use it in the academic way. But when your friend down the pub uses it in the colloquial way, there's no need to correct them. Otherwise, you'll look like a total fanny. Same idea applies to the use of definitions A and B. So, to clarify, I used to use definition A, but I would say B is more accurate. However, both have utility. Definition A isn't wrong either, it's just a different and far more common meaning expressed by the same word. Some of you might be wondering what caused me to do a complete 180 on the question of metalcore. Well, I was so used to hearing fuckwits dismiss any and all metal they don't like as not being real metal, that any sincere disagreement over metalcore's genre went in one ear and out the other. What changed my mind was seeing fans of metalcore argue that it's a hardcore subgenre, and that's when I realised I should take that argument more seriously. Now that we've established that, let's take a look at some subgenres I didn't cover. Firstly, I'll explain gothic metal. Now, contrary to the assertions of the Rangers supporting geniuses I went to school with, I'm no a goth, nor am I particularly familiar with or interested in goth culture. But to give a quick summary, goth is not just a fashion style, it has certain music associated with it. Gothic music has a particular dark tone and atmosphere, but it's very versatile and can be combined with almost any music genre. Post-punk, industrial, cybergoth? Goth rock developed out of post-punk, and after its popularisation by bands like the Sisters of Mercy and Balaam and Angel, it was only a matter of time before metal got the goth treatment. After all, gothic music and metal both have an affinity for the occult and other assorted evil imagery. Seems like a natural pairing. Gothic metal first emerged out of the development of death doom. Paradise Lost, My Dying Bride and Anathema, known as the Peaceville 3 as they were all signed to that record label, are credited with the initial creation of Gothic doom, as they added some experimental instrumentation and vocals to their death doom sounds. Gothic doom is characterised partly by its goth aesthetic, but mostly by the dark and gloomy atmosphere of the music, using keyboards and quite often using female backing vocals. Sometimes this atmosphere can be spooky in a genuinely unsettling way, and sometimes it can be spooky in a corny Nightmare Before Christmas kind of way, but that's goth for you. Due to its versatility, there isn't really a single band you can point to as an all-rounder summary, so I'll examine two case studies that I happen to be familiar with, who also happen to be two of the best known bands under this category. Each of these play a different style of gothic metal. Now before I go on, you could probably count Marilyn Manson as industrial gothic metal, but let's not talk about him anymore. Let's start with Type O Negative, who play gothic doom. And yes, this time I'm sure of it. They take doom metal with its slow tempo, heavy guitars, clean singing and doomy atmosphere, and they make it even more eerie and dark. The guitar parts often have these reverb-drenched, depressing sounding notes ripped straight from post-punk to complement the riffs. As for the vocals, rather than Sabbath worship or fucking belting it out like Candlemas, the late Peter Steele's singing was famous for its very deep and sensual delivery, rolling every R that he possibly could. Basically, it sounds like Dracula wants to fuck you. Yeah, sex appeal is often a factor in the popularity of goth musicians, and it was certainly something that Peter Steele leaned into, going as far as doing a shoot for Playgirl. Now, I don't find men attractive, so I can't tell if the photos of him with his knob out succeed at being sexy, but they do succeed at being funny.
Hello, you've reached Peter Steele's cock. Peter can't come to the phone right now. Please leave a message.
Type O Negative were very popular as alternative music goes, and they were a gateway into heavy music for a lot of people. Some of the lyrics are a tad corny, but I think their music has aged really well.
No, you answer me in deafening voice, please. Higher pitch. Higher. Danny filth. Very, very good.
Another big name in gothic metal is Cradle of Filth. You probably know them as that band Richmond likes in the IT crowd. Black metal fans have been getting confused for goths from day one, so combining the two was a no-brainer. Cradle of Filth started out making black metal with some gothic sounding keyboards and guitar melodies, and with each new album they leaned more and more into the gothic side of their sound, with the black metal parts becoming more subtle. They're still there in the vocals and riffs, but the production got a lot cleaner, and more melodic choruses and vocals were introduced. Now, I know they softened their sound and got more accessible, but their popularity was still insane for something with any black metal influence whatsoever. Cradle of Filth were so popular that Bring Me the Horizon expect their fans to know who Danny Filth is. As I mentioned way back in part 1, their popularity naturally meant that they were rejected by the black metal community as a false. Now, I imagine most folk will roll their eyes at that, but to be completely fair in this case, making your music accessible is pretty much the exact opposite of the ethos of the second wave of black metal. So I can see why that started. Although I don't know why so many people think artists have any obligation to follow the weird hang-ups of a very insecure dead guy. Other gothic metal bands of note include Tiamat, Moonspell and Lacuna Coil. But due to the versatility of gothic metal, there are a lot of bands it can apply to. For example, Nightwish have some goth influences in their symphonic metal sound. Essentially, gothic is another modifier like blackened. It can be applied to pretty much any subgenre. That being said, I've yet to see anyone try to make goth grind a thing, but I'm sure it's out there somewhere. Well, that's as much as we have time for in this part, but before I go, when I first covered grindcore I didn't do a very good job. I corrected the most glaring mistakes in part 6, but I still don't think I did it justice. So I think I'll talk about some stuff I missed out, and in true grindcore fashion, I'll try to do so in under a minute. Grindcore is punk's answer to death metal. It is known for its intense speed, often political lyrics and twisted sense of humour. It was started in Michigan by Repulsion in the 80s, who sounded too noisy and chaotic to just be hardcore or death metal. Due to issues in the studio when recording their album, they lost the bass tracks and just had to use the rough scratch tracks whose grindy sound appealed to their fans. Although according to Napalm Death, the name Grindcore was actually coined by Mick Harris, who is also credited with developing the blast beat. Napalm Death exploded with fame after Scum was played on the radio by legendary British DJ John Peel. There was an overseas back and forth between England and the US, with Repulsion, Napalm Death and Terrorizer. Despite the genre's deliberately anti-musical approaches, encouraged avant-garde experimentation to the extent that you could honestly call bands like Discordance acts as progressive. Noisecore focuses on sounding as noisy, chaotic and unmusical as possible. This is why Death Charge play guitar with their dicks. Goregrind is inspired by Carcass and uses low-tuned guitars and artificially lowered vocals to make songs about gore. Many of the album covers use real pictures of dead bodies, so don't look them up if you can't stomach that. Mincecore is a modern revival of old-school grindcore with explicitly leftist politics in response to reactionary tendencies in Goregrind. The incomprehensible vocals have led to grindcore having an international following, transcending language barriers, and as such there are more bands than I can count, so I'll just shout out a few that I happen to like that I didn't mention before. Nasum, Wormrock, Kill the Client, Cretin and Insect Warfare, whose album World Extermination is my favourite grindcore album and my admittedly casual appreciation for the genre. I can safely say grindcore is the music genre with the best band names ever, and I will die on this hill. I'm afraid that was just over 1 minute, so sorry about that. See you next time.